Lightning split the sky over Fallow Ridge Sanctuary, and every animal in the compound went still at once. In the wolf enclosure, a gray shape pressed low against the fence, ears flat, eyes wide open in the dark. Her name was Luna, and she had not made a sound in 9 years. Not a whimper, not a growl, not a single howl. The younger wolves around her scattered toward the trees when the thunder cracked again, but Luna did not move. She had learned long ago that running did not protect you from everything. Some things followed no matter how fast you went. Grace Ashford stood at the observation window with a flashlight in one hand and a radio in the other, watching the old wolf through the rain-streaked glass. She had worked at the sanctuary for 6 years, and in all that time, Luna had never once looked directly at her. Tonight was no different. The wolf's yellow eyes stayed fixed on the tree line, as though she expected something to step out of the dark. "She's doing it again," Grace said into the radio, standing at the fence like she's waiting for someone. "Waiting for what?" came the crackled reply from Daniel Marsh, the sanctuary's night manager. "I don't know. She's done it every storm this month." Grace had read every file the sanctuary kept on Luna. The wolf had come to Fallow Ridge 9 years earlier, found alone in the mountains, after the rest of her pack had been killed by hunters who mistook them for a threat to livestock. Luna had been the only survivor, dragged half-frozen out of a ravine by a rescue team that almost gave up on her twice. She had lived at the sanctuary ever since, growing older among wolves that were not her own, never fully belonging, never fully alone. The vets had said, in the beginning, that her silence was simply grief. Wolves howl to call to their pack, to say, "I am here, where are you, come back to me." Luna had no pack left to call, so she had stopped calling. 9 winters had passed since then, and not one howl had crossed her lips, even when the other wolves sang together under a full moon, and the whole valley rang with their voices. Luna would lie in the farthest corner of her enclosure, with her head on her paws, listening, but never joining in. The sanctuary staff had tried everything to draw her voice back. They had played recordings of wild wolf packs. They had introduced new wolves, hoping companionship might loosen something inside her. They had even brought in an animal behaviorist from the state university, who spent 3 weeks studying Luna's patterns without success. Nothing worked. The old wolf simply watched, and waited, and stayed silent. Grace had her own theory, one she never shared with the visiting scientists because it sounded too much like something from a children's story. She believed Luna was not broken. She believed the wolf was choosing her silence, saving her voice for something that had not happened yet. That night, after the storm passed and the sky cleared to a scatter of stars, Grace made her final round of the enclosures. She stopped at Luna's fence, as she always did, and crouched down low so she would not tower over the wolf. "Someday you're going to surprise us all," she said quietly. "I just hope I'm here to see it." Luna did not turn her head, but her ears shifted slightly, catching the sound of the woman's voice. It was the smallest possible sign of attention, and Grace had learned over the years to treasure these small signs, because with Luna, they were the only signs there were. 3 miles down the gravel road that connected the sanctuary to the county highway, a very different kind of trouble was unfolding. A horse trailer had jackknifed on the wet turn near Miller's Creek, and inside it, a young mare named Wren was thrown hard against the metal wall, cutting her foreleg and driving her into a blind, terrified panic. The driver, a rancher named Peter Lindquist, had been transporting Wren to a new farm after her previous owner could no longer afford to keep her. Now he stood in the rain with his phone pressed to his ear, trying to explain to the emergency line that his trailer was off the road, his horse was hurt, and he needed help fast. "She's kicking the walls apart," Peter said, his voice tight with worry. "I can't get near her." The dispatcher on the line stayed calm, the way dispatchers are trained to. "Help is on the way, sir. Try to keep your distance. Don't approach the trailer." Peter paced the muddy shoulder of the road, watching the trailer rock with each frightened kick from inside. Wren was not a large horse, but fear made animals stronger than their size suggested, and the metal walls groaned under the force of her panic. He had owned horses his whole life, and had never seen one this terrified, this desperate to escape a space that had suddenly become a trap instead of shelter. It took 11 minutes for the first response vehicle to arrive, though to Peter it felt like an hour. A veterinary emergency truck pulled up behind his own vehicle, and a woman climbed out, already pulling on thick gloves, a case of sedation equipment in her other hand. "I'm Claire Winters," she said, raising her voice over the sound of the rain and the horse's continued struggle. "Tell me what happened." Peter explained quickly. The turn, the skid, the sound of the trailer wall buckling, before he had even come to a full stop. Claire moved toward the trailer slowly, speaking low and even, the kind of voice meant to calm rather than alarm. "Hey there," she said, close enough now to see one dark rolling eye through the trailer's side vent. "Hey, I'm here. I'm not going to hurt you." Wren screamed, a high, awful sound that echoed off the wet trees lining the road, and slammed her injured leg against the wall again. Blood had begun to soak through the trailer's floor mat, dripping in a thin, dark line onto the road below. Claire worked fast but never rushed her movements, aware that any sudden motion could send the horse into a worse frenzy. She managed to get a sedative into Wren through a small gap in the trailer's side panel, and within a few long minutes, the kicking slowed, then stopped. The silence that followed was almost harder to bear than the noise had been. "She's out!" Claire called back to Peter. "We need to get this door open carefully. She's still got a bad cut on that near foreleg." It took 4 people, working in careful coordination, to open the trailer, ease Wren onto her feet, and walk her slowly down a ramp into the waiting horse ambulance. The mare's legs trembled with the after effects of both the sedative and the accident, and her eyes, though quieter now, still carried a wildness that told anyone looking that something inside her had been shaken loose that night, something that would take more than stitches to heal. "Where's she headed?" Peter asked, standing at the back of the ambulance as Claire checked the wound one final time before closing the doors. "Fallow Ridge," Claire answered. "They've got space, and the right kind of quiet for a horse that's been through something like this. She needs time more than anything else." Peter nodded, though guilt sat heavy in his chest. He had not caused the storm or the slick road, but he had been the one behind the wheel, and Wren had been the one to pay for it. "Take care of her," he said, and there was nothing else he could offer beyond those words. Claire climbed into the ambulance beside the sedated mare and placed a steady hand on her neck as the vehicle pulled away into the wet dark, tires hissing over the road toward Fallow Ridge. She did not know yet what waited for Wren at the sanctuary. She did not know about the old wolf who watched every storm from behind a fence, waiting for something the rest of the world had already stopped expecting. But she knew, the way anyone who has spent a life around frightened animals comes to know, that healing rarely follows a straight path, and sometimes, the strangest company turns out to be exactly what a wounded creature needs. By the time the ambulance reached the sanctuary gates, the storm had faded to a light drizzle, and the eastern sky had begun to show the first gray hint of morning. Daniel Marsh was waiting at the entrance with a golf cart and a clipboard, having been alerted an hour earlier that an injured mare would need emergency stabling. He guided the ambulance toward the old stable block at the edge of the property, a quiet structure set apart from the main animal enclosures, chosen specifically for its distance from the noise of the daytime visitor paths. What none of them realized, not Daniel, not Claire, not even Grace finishing her long night shift nearby, was that the stable sat directly across a narrow service road from Luna's enclosure, separated by no more than 60 feet of open ground and a single low fence. As the stable doors rolled open and the sedated mare was carried gently inside on a support sling, a shape moved in the enclosure across the road. Luna had risen from her usual corner and walked to the fence nearest the commotion, her nose lifted into the wind, drawing in the sharp new sense of blood, fear, and unfamiliar animal that had just arrived at Fallow Ridge. For the first time in longer than anyone could remember, the old wolf's body was not still. It was alert. It was listening. And somewhere behind her old, tired eyes, something that had been dormant for 9 winters had just begun, quietly, to stir. Grace noticed it first, catching sight of Luna's posture from the observation window as she finished her paperwork. She set down her pen and watched the wolf a long moment, feeling a small, unexplainable chill move through her. "What is it, girl?" she murmured to herself, though Luna was too far away to hear. "What did you just figure out?" Outside, the drizzle finally stopped, and the first true light of morning touched the wet grass between the wolf enclosure and the stable, illuminating the narrow gap between 2 damaged creatures who did not yet know each other existed, but whose paths, after 9 long years of silence and 1 terrible night on a rain-slicked road, had just quietly begun to cross. The sanctuary slowly came awake around them. Birds returned to the fence posts. A rooster, somewhere near the barn, called out the arrival of day. And through it all, Luna remained at her fence, eyes fixed on the stable across the road, waiting, the way she always waited. But this time, for a reason she was only beginning to understand herself. By mid-morning, word of the injured mare had spread through the small staff of Fallow Ridge Sanctuary. Nora Fenwick, the head veterinarian, arrived to examine Wren properly now that the sedation had worn off enough for a careful assessment. The cut on the mare's foreleg was deep but clean, the kind of wound that would heal well with rest and proper care, though the deeper injury, the one no stitches could reach, worried Nora far more. "Physically she'll mend in a few weeks," Nora told Daniel, as they stood outside the stable stall, watching Wren press herself into the farthest corner, still trembling at every sound. "It's the fear that concerns me. I've seen horses come back from injuries like this fine. I've seen fewer come back from a fright this deep, without carrying it for a long time." Daniel nodded, making a note on his clipboard. "Any idea what she needs?" "Quiet," Nora said. "Patience. And honestly, something to trust again. Horses like this, they don't heal because we tell them they're safe. They heal because something shows them." Wren had arrived at Fallow Ridge with almost nothing recorded about her early life. The paperwork from her previous owner was thin, noting only that she had been purchased as a yearling and passed between 3 different farms in the years since, never quite settling anywhere long enough to form the kind of bond that gives a horse confidence. She was gentle by nature, the kind of animal that wanted peace more than anything, but life had handed her one disruption after another, until the night on the rain-soaked road had pushed her past whatever calm she had left. Grace stopped by the stable during her afternoon rounds, curious about the new arrival everyone had been talking about. She stood at a respectful distance from the stall door and studied the mare quietly. Wren's ears flicked toward her, then away, uncertain whether the newcomer meant safety or danger. "Hey there," Grace said softly, the same low, even tone she used with every frightened animal in her care. "Rough night, huh?" Wren shifted her weight but did not come closer. Grace did not push. She had learned long ago that trust could not be rushed, that some animals needed to watch a person exist quietly nearby for days before deciding whether that person deserved attention. Across the road, Luna had not moved far from her fence since sunrise. She had eaten little of her morning meal, leaving most of it untouched in the enclosure, an unusual break from her normal routine. The other wolves in her group gave her a wide berth, sensing correctly that something in her was different today, though none of them understood what. Daniel noticed it during his own rounds and radioed the observation team. "Luna's off her food again. Anyone got eyes on her?" "I do," Grace answered, walking toward the enclosure from the stable side of the property. "She's been at the fence most of the morning, staring at the stable." There was a pause on the radio. The stable. Why would she care about the stable? Grace looked across the narrow service road that separated the two structures, at the old wolf pressed low against the wire, ears forward, nose working the air. "I don't know," she said, "but I don't think it's nothing." Over the following days, a quiet pattern began to form, one that only Grace seemed to notice at first, because she was the one who spent the most hours near both enclosures. Luna would rise from her usual resting place each time a sound came from the stable, whether it was Wren shifting her weight, or a bucket being set down, or the low murmur of a keeper's voice checking on the mare's wound. The old wolf's attention had shifted entirely toward that one small building across the road, and for the first time in longer than Grace could remember, Luna seemed almost restless, as though some part of her wanted to move but had not yet decided where. Nora, still focused on Wren's physical recovery, changed the mare's bandage each morning, and noted with quiet relief that the wound was closing well. The deeper fear, though, remained unchanged. Wren still startled at footsteps, still flattened her ears at unfamiliar sounds, still pressed into the corner of her stall whenever a door opened faster than she expected. Sedatives had eased her body that first night, but they could do nothing for the part of her that no longer trusted the world to be safe. "She needs a friend," Nora said one afternoon, more to herself than to anyone else, standing at the stall door with her arms crossed. "Something that doesn't ask anything of her, something that's just there." It was an idea the sanctuary had tried before with other traumatized animals, pairing a frightened newcomer with a calm, steady companion, usually another horse or a gentle goat, kept for exactly that purpose. But Fallow Ridge's usual companion animals were all housed on the far side of the property, and moving them would take time and planning the small staff did not currently have to spare. Meanwhile, Luna's restlessness continued to grow. On the third night after Ren's arrival, Grace stayed later than her shift required, drawn by an instinct she could not entirely explain, and watched from the observation window as the old wolf paced the length of her enclosure fence nearest the stable, back and forth, something clearly working itself loose inside her after 9 long years of stillness. "What are you thinking, old girl?" Grace whispered to the glass, though of course no answer came. Luna simply kept pacing, her eyes never leaving the direction of the stable, as though she were listening for something only she could hear, waiting for a moment that had not yet arrived, but was, without question, coming closer with each passing hour. Grace made a note in the observation log before she finally left for the night, a small entry that would later prove far more important than she realized at the time. Luna showing unusual interest in stable area since new arrival. Recommend continued monitoring. She closed the folder, switched off the light, and glanced one last time toward the wolf enclosure, where Luna stood at the fence exactly as she had for 3 nights running, patient in a way that felt, to Grace, less like waiting and more like preparing. The fence between Luna's enclosure and the stable service road had been built for a different purpose entirely, meant only to keep visitors on the walking path from wandering too close to the wolves. It had never been designed to hold back an animal determined to reach the other side, and by the end of that first week, a small gap had begun to show at one corner, where the wire met a wooden post, worn loose by weather and time, rather than by any deliberate effort. Henry Colt, the maintenance worker responsible for the sanctuary's fencing, noticed the gap during his weekly inspection and made a note to repair it before the weekend. He mentioned it to Daniel almost as an afterthought while filling out his report. "Nothing serious," Henry said. "Old wires just given a little at the corner post near the stable road. I'll patch it Thursday." Daniel nodded without much concern, his attention on a dozen other small tasks that made up a normal day at the sanctuary. Neither of them thought much more about it, and the repair slipped, as small tasks sometimes do, into the following week instead. That gap, small as it was, became the first real opportunity Luna had needed. On the 4th night after Ren's arrival, under a sky heavy with clouds but without rain, the old wolf did something she had not done in longer than any of the staff could recall. She left her resting place well before midnight, moved with deliberate, quiet steps to the loosened corner of the fence, and pressed her body against the gap until the wire gave just enough for her to slip through. She did not run. She did not rush toward the stable the way a younger, more excitable animal might have. Instead, Luna moved across the narrow service road slowly, low to the ground, pausing every few steps to test the air, to listen, to make certain no one and nothing waited to stop her. 9 years of careful survival had taught her patience above all else, and she carried that patience with her now, even as something long buried inside her pushed her forward one careful step at a time. Inside the stable, Ren stood awake in the dark, unable to settle the way healthy rest required. The mare's wound had improved enough that the ache no longer kept her from sleep, but the deeper unease remained, and most nights found her standing rather than lying down, ears constantly tuned to every creak of the old building around her. She heard the soft scrape of something moving outside the stable wall and went rigid, nostrils flaring, heart already climbing toward the same panic that had gripped her the night of the accident. Then a new scent reached her, one she did not recognize, carried faintly through the gap beneath the stable door. It was not the scent of the humans who came and went each day with their gentle voices and careful hands. It was something older, wilder, and yet somehow it did not spike her fear the way she expected. She stood very still, listening, as the sound of soft footsteps stopped just outside the door. Luna settled onto the ground outside the stable, close enough to feel the faint warmth radiating from the wooden walls, close enough to hear the mare's breathing shift from ragged to something slightly steadier. She did not attempt to enter. She simply lay down in the dirt beside the structure, her body curled the way wolves curl when they mean to stay through the night, and closed her eyes, listening to the sound of another creature breathing nearby for the first time in 9 years. Neither animal understood, in any way a person might explain it, what was happening between them. There was no plan, no decision reached through thought the way humans reach decisions. There was only instinct, old and simple, the same instinct that has always told frightened creatures that being alone in the dark is harder than being less alone, even when the company makes no obvious sense. By morning, Grace arrived for her early shift and immediately noticed Luna's absence from her usual enclosure. She checked the fence line out of habit before panic could set in, and found the gap at the corner post, wire bent outward rather than in, the unmistakable sign that an animal had pushed through from the inside rather than broken in from outside. Her first thought was fear, sharp and immediate, the kind every keeper dreads. An escaped animal meant danger, both to the animal and to anyone it might encounter beyond the sanctuary's boundaries. She radioed Daniel at once, her voice tight with urgency. "Luna's out. Gap in the fence near the stable road. I need eyes on her now." It took less than 2 minutes to find her. Luna had not gone far at all. She lay curled against the outer wall of the stable, exactly where she had settled the night before, and when Grace rounded the corner of the building, flashlight raised, prepared for almost anything, she found instead a scene so unexpected that she stopped walking entirely and simply stared. The old wolf lay peacefully in the dirt, eyes half open, watching the stable door with an expression Grace had never once seen on her in 6 years of care. It was not fear. It was not distress. It was something closer to calm, closer to purpose, as though Luna had finally arrived somewhere she had been trying to reach for a very long time. "Oh," Grace said quietly, lowering the flashlight. "Oh, you clever old girl." She radioed Daniel back immediately. "Cancel the alert. She's fine. She's lying by the stable." "The stable? Is she trying to get in?" Grace studied Luna a moment longer, noting the deliberate calm in the wolf's posture, the complete absence of aggression or agitation. "I don't think she's trying to get in," she said slowly. "I think she's exactly where she wants to be." Inside the stable, Wren had finally lain down as well, her injured leg tucked carefully beneath her, breathing slow and even for the first time since her arrival. Whether she understood what waited just beyond her wall, no one could say for certain. But something in the mare's posture that morning had softened, the tight coil of fear in her muscles easing just enough to let real rest take hold, and Nora, arriving for the morning check soon after, would note the change in her clipboard with quiet surprise, unaware yet of the small gray shape curled outside the stable wall that might have had everything to do with it. Word of the wolf sleeping outside the stable spread through the small sanctuary staff within hours, and by midday, nearly everyone had found an excuse to walk past the stable road at least once, hoping to catch a glimpse of the strange new arrangement for themselves. Daniel stood with Nora near the fence, both of them watching Luna, who had not moved from her spot against the stable wall even as the sun climbed higher, and the morning routines of the sanctuary carried on around her. "I've never seen her choose to be this close to anything," Daniel admitted. "Not another wolf, not a keeper, nothing." Nora crossed her arms, considering the scene with the same careful attention she gave any unusual medical development. "Horses and wolves aren't supposed to trust each other at all," she said. "Everything in a horse's instincts tells it a wolf means danger, and everything in a wolf's instincts tells it a horse is either threat or prey. This shouldn't be happening." "And yet," Grace said, joining them at the fence, "here we are." The decision facing the staff was not a simple one. Sanctuary policy existed for good reason, built around the safety of every animal in their care, and an old wolf choosing to lie beside an injured horse fell so far outside normal protocol that no existing guideline told them what to do next. Some among the staff, particularly the newer volunteers, argued the fence should be repaired immediately, and Luna returned to her proper enclosure before anything went wrong. "What if she decides the horse looks like a meal one night instead of a companion?" asked one of the volunteers, a reasonable concern given everything the textbook said about predator and prey. Nora considered the question seriously before answering. "Luna is 12 years old. She's lived at this sanctuary for 9 of those years, fed every single day by hand, never once shown a hunting instinct toward any horse, goat, or bird on this property. If she wanted to hurt that mare, she has had 4 nights alone with her and hasn't." It was Grace, though, who made the argument that ultimately shaped what came next. She had spent more hours near both animals than anyone else on staff, and she spoke now, with the quiet conviction of someone who had watched something the data alone could not explain. "I think we're looking at this wrong," she said. "We keep asking if it's safe for the horse to be near the wolf. But look at Wren. She slept last night for the first time since she arrived. Really slept. And look at Luna. 9 years, and she's finally moved from that corner of her enclosure like it costs her nothing at all." Grace paused, choosing her next words carefully. Maybe the question isn't whether this is safe. Maybe it's whether we're willing to let something help that we don't fully understand. The debate carried on through the afternoon, moving eventually into Daniel's small office at the center of the property, where Nora spread out both animals' files across the desk and reviewed every note, every behavior log, every small detail that might inform the decision ahead. In the end, it was agreed that the fence gap would not be repaired immediately, not until the staff had a chance to observe the pairing more closely under carefully controlled conditions. A camera was set up along the stable's outer wall, aimed to capture the space where Luna had chosen to rest, and additional staff hours were arranged to monitor both animals through the coming nights. If anything changes, Nora said, closing the last file, if there's any sign of stress in either animal, we separate them immediately. Agreed? Everyone in the small office nodded, and with that, Fallow Ridge Sanctuary made a decision that none of them could have predicted making a week earlier, choosing to let an old, silent wolf and a frightened young mare continue whatever quiet arrangement they had begun to build between themselves. That evening, as the sun sank low behind the tree line and the sanctuary settled into its nightly rhythms, Grace returned to the stable one final time before her shift ended. Luna had already resumed her place against the outer wall, curled low, ears occasionally flicking toward the soft sounds coming from within. Grace crouched at a careful distance, watching the old wolf for a long moment. "You've got everyone talking about you," she said softly. 9 years of quiet, and now you're the biggest mystery this place has ever had." Luna's eyes shifted briefly toward her, then back toward the stable wall, unbothered, patient, entirely unconcerned with the debate she had unknowingly caused among the humans who cared for her. Whatever pulled her toward that small building night after night, it existed on a level far simpler and far older than sanctuary policy or scientific explanation, something that predated the rules built to keep animals safely apart, something that understood, in a way words could never quite capture, that some wounds heal best in company, regardless of what shape that company happens to take. As night fully settled over Fallow Ridge, Grace made her final rounds and paused once more at the stable's edge. Inside, Wren stood near the wall closest to where Luna lay, closer than she had come to any boundary since her arrival, her injured leg no longer trembling with each small sound from beyond the wood. Whatever waited on the other side of that wall, the mare no longer needed to fear it the way she once had, and that alone told Grace everything the science had not yet caught up to explaining. 10 days after Wren's arrival, a mistake that could have gone very wrong, instead became the moment everything changed. Henry Colt, hurrying to finish his evening rounds before a second storm system rolled through the valley, latched the stable's side door in haste and failed to notice the bolt had not fully caught. It was a small oversight, the kind any tired worker might make at the end of a long day, but it left a narrow opening along the door's edge, just wide enough for a determined animal to push through. Luna found it within the hour. She had grown bolder over the 10 nights since first slipping through the fence gap, no longer content to simply lie against the outer wall while the scent and sound of the mare drifted through the wood. Something in her had shifted, some old caution finally giving way to a pull stronger than habit, and when she found the loose door that night, she did not hesitate the way she once might have. She pressed her nose against the gap, felt it give slightly under the pressure, and worked her body through the narrow space until she stood, for the first time, inside the stable itself. Wren went rigid immediately, every muscle locking as the unfamiliar shape moved into the dim light of the stall. This was different from the muffled scent through a wooden wall. This was close, immediate, undeniable, and every instinct built into generations of horses screamed a single warning through the mare's racing heart. But Luna did not advance the way a predator advances. She stopped several feet away, lowered herself to the ground with slow, deliberate care, and simply waited, her body language carrying none of the tension that precedes a hunt. She had done this before with skittish creatures in her younger years, long before the loss that silenced her, and some deep memory of patience guided her now even after 9 years of forgetting almost everything else about her old life. Minutes passed in absolute stillness. Wren's breathing remained fast, her ears pinned, her whole body coiled to bolt if the wolf so much as shifted a paw. But Luna did not move again. She simply lay there, eyes calm, waiting the way water waits for stone to wear down, patient in a way that had no deadline attached to it. Slowly, so slowly that even the camera footage reviewed later would show only gradual change rather than any single dramatic moment, Wren's ears began to loosen. Her breathing evened. The tight coil of her muscles eased by degrees, until finally, close to an hour after Luna had entered the stable, the mare lowered her head slightly, no longer holding herself in the rigid posture of an animal prepared to run. Grace discovered them together during her midnight check, standing frozen in the stable doorway with her flashlight lowered the moment she understood what she was seeing. Luna lay curled on the straw a few feet from where Wren now stood, with her head hung low in something that finally resembled rest rather than fear. Neither animal reacted to Grace's presence beyond a brief flick of attention before returning their focus to each other, as though the human in the doorway mattered far less than whatever quiet understanding had passed between them. Grace backed away without a sound, careful not to disturb whatever fragile peace had settled over the stable, and radioed Daniel from a safe distance down the service road. "She's inside," Grace whispered, though there was no one nearby to overhear. "Luna's inside the stable, with the horse, and nothing's wrong at all." Daniel arrived within minutes, and together they watched from the doorway, careful to keep their presence minimal, documenting what they could without interrupting the delicate calm that had taken root inside. Nora was called as well, arriving still in her nightclothes, drawn from sleep by the news that felt too important to wait until morning. "In 9 years," Nora said quietly, standing beside Grace at the stable door. "I don't think I've ever seen her choose closeness to anything. Not another wolf, not a keeper, nothing." "Maybe she wasn't choosing closeness before," Grace said. "Maybe she was just waiting for the right one to choose it with." The three of them stood together a long while, watching two damaged creatures share a space that neither predator nor prey instinct should have allowed, until finally, satisfied that no danger loomed in either direction, they left the stable door as it was and returned to their separate posts, letting the night carry on around the strange, quiet peace that had settled over Fallow Ridge. By morning, Wren was found lying fully down in the straw for the first time since her arrival, her injured leg tucked beneath her, her breathing slow and untroubled. Luna lay a short distance away, awake but calm, watching the door with the same patient alertness she had once reserved only for storms and shadows. Something in the old wolf's posture had changed overnight, something the staff would spend the coming days trying to name, though the closest anyone came to describing it was a single word that Grace wrote in the observation log that morning, underlined twice for emphasis: peace. Over the following 2 weeks, the arrangement between Luna and Wren settled into something the staff at Fallow Ridge began, cautiously, to call a routine. Each evening, once the visitor paths closed and the sanctuary quieted for the night, Luna would make her way through the fence gap that Henry had, at Daniel's specific instruction, chosen not to repair, and cross the narrow service road to the stable, where the side door remained deliberately unlatched from that point forward. Wren, for her part, had begun to anticipate these visits, standing near the door in the last hour of daylight, ears turned toward the sound of the wolf's approaching footsteps, long before Luna actually appeared. Nora tracked the mare's physical recovery with growing satisfaction. The wound on her foreleg had closed completely, leaving only a thin line of scar tissue that would fade further with time, and the limp that had marked her first uncertain steps around the stall had all but disappeared. More remarkable to Nora, though, was the change in Wren's overall demeanor. The horse that had once flattened her ears and pressed into corners at every unfamiliar sound now stood calmly through routine examinations, occasionally even leaning her head toward Grace or Nora during a check, seeking contact rather than avoiding it. "I've treated a lot of frightened animals," Nora told Daniel one afternoon, reviewing Wren's latest chart, "and I've never seen recovery move this fast. Not from the fear side of things. The body heals on its own schedule. The mind usually takes much longer." "You think it's the wolf?" Daniel asked. Nora considered the question, with the same careful weighing she gave every medical judgment. "I think," she said slowly, "that whatever Luna is offering her, it isn't something we could have provided ourselves, no matter how patient we were. There's something in being chosen by another animal, something that tells a frightened creature it's safe, in a language words can't quite reach." The bond extended beyond the nightly stable visits as the weeks passed. Grace began to notice Luna lingering near the stable, even during daylight hours, something entirely new for a wolf who had spent 9 years retreating to the farthest, most hidden corner of her enclosure, whenever visitors walked the nearby paths. Now Luna would rest in open view near the fence closest to the stable, seemingly untroubled by the presence of onlookers, her attention fixed instead on the building across the road, where her unlikely companion waited out the daylight hours. Word of the pairing spread beyond the sanctuary staff, eventually reaching a small local newspaper reporter, who requested permission to observe and write a short piece on the unusual friendship. Daniel agreed cautiously, on the condition that the reporter maintain a respectful distance and avoid disturbing either animal's routine. The resulting article, modest as it was, captured something of the wonder the staff themselves had come to feel, describing the old wolf's transformation from a withdrawn, silent animal into one that now moved through her days with visible purpose, all of it centered around a single stable at the edge of the property. Not every night passed without difficulty, however. Roughly 3 weeks into the arrangement, a series of storms rolled through the valley in quick succession, each one testing the fragile new calm that had settled over both animals. During the worst of these storms, a fallen tree limb near the perimeter fence set off a chain reaction of unsettled behavior throughout the sanctuary, spooking several of the horses in the main barn and sending a ripple of anxious energy through animals across the property. Grace, caught in the middle of managing the wider disturbance, worried briefly that the chaos might undo the fragile trust built between Luna and Wren. She hurried to the stable as soon as she could break away from the main barn, flashlight cutting through sheets of rain, half expecting to find the mare in full panic once again. Instead, she found Wren standing close against the stall wall nearest Luna, trembling slightly at the thunder, but nowhere near the frantic state that had marked her first night at the sanctuary. Luna lay pressed against the same wall from her side, close enough that the mare could feel the warmth of her body through the wood, and though the old wolf's ears flicked at each crack of thunder, she did not rise, did not retreat, did not abandon her post beside the frightened horse, even as the storm raged outside. Grace stood in the stable doorway, soaked through from her hurried walk across the property, and felt something in her chest loosen at the sight before her. Whatever this bond was, built from nothing more than proximity and instinct and whatever silent language passed between two damaged creatures in the dark, it was holding, it was real. And it was, she realized, as she watched Luna's steady, protective stillness beside the trembling mare, exactly the kind of thing no textbook or training manual could have taught either animal to offer the other. She did not disturb them. She simply pulled the stable door closed against the worst of the wind, checked that both animals had what they needed for the night, and left them to weather the storm together, exactly as they had chosen to do every night since the fence first gave way, beneath an old wolf's patient determination. News of the bond between Luna and Wren eventually reached Margaret Doyle, an animal behaviorist who had studied wolf and equine interactions for over 20 years, and had, in fact, been one of the specialists consulted years earlier, when the sanctuary first attempted to understand Luna's prolonged silence. She arrived at Fallow Ridge on a quiet Tuesday morning, notebook in hand, eager to observe a pairing so unusual that she had, in her own words, never encountered anything quite like it in 2 decades of fieldwork. Predator and prey species almost never form attachments like this, Margaret explained to Daniel and Nora as they walked together toward the stable. It happens occasionally in captivity, where instinct softens under the right conditions, but even then, it's rare, and it's almost never this immediate or this deep. She spent 3 full days observing the pair, taking careful notes on their body language, their patterns of rest, the subtle ways they seemed to respond to one another's moods. What struck her most, she told the staff during a debrief in Daniel's office, was not simply that the bond existed, but the manner in which it seemed to serve both animals equally. Wren gained calm, Margaret said, tapping her notebook. That much is obvious from every angle. But look at Luna. Look at her posture, her appetite, the way she interacts with the rest of her pack now, compared to before this began. She's not just offering comfort, she's receiving it too. Grace, sitting quietly at the edge of the meeting, found herself thinking about grief in a way she had not fully considered before. She had always understood Luna's silence as a wound left by the loss of her original pack, a wound too deep for 9 years of care and safety to heal on its own. But listening to Margaret speak, she began to wonder whether the missing piece had never been safety at all. Perhaps what Luna needed, the entire time, was not protection but purpose, something to watch over, something whose fear she could ease the way no one had ever eased her own. Wolves are built to care for something, Margaret continued, as though she had read the thought directly from Grace's expression. A lone wolf isn't just missing companionship, It's missing the role that companionship gives it. Luna spent 9 years with nothing to protect, nothing to guide, nothing depending on her the way a pack depends on its members. And then a frightened horse showed up, needing exactly what she still had left to give. The explanation settled over the small office with quiet weight. It did not undo 9 years of silence in a single afternoon, and it did not promise that Luna would ever howl again. But it offered, for the first time, a reason that made sense of everything the staff had witnessed since Ren's arrival. A reason rooted, not in mystery, but in something achingly simple and deeply understandable. That evening, as Margaret prepared to leave the sanctuary, she asked to observe the pair one final time before her departure. Grace walked with her to the stable, arriving just as the last light of day faded from the sky, and together they watched Luna cross the service road with her now familiar unhurried gait, slipping through the fence gap and moving toward the stable door, where Ren already waited, ears pricked forward in anticipation rather than fear. "In all my years," Margaret said quietly, watching the mare lower her head to greet the approaching wolf with something that looked, unmistakably, like relief, "I don't think I've seen anything quite this remarkable. Whatever this is, it isn't something we engineered. It isn't something we can replicate on command. This is something they built themselves, out of nothing but need and instinct and whatever it is that lets two broken things recognize each other." Grace said nothing for a long moment, simply watching as Luna settled into the straw beside Ren, the two of them arranging themselves for the night, exactly as they had every evening for weeks now. Comfortable, familiar, entirely their own. "I used to think Luna's silence was just something we had to accept," Grace finally said. "Something that would never really change. I'm starting to think we just hadn't found the right reason yet." Margaret smiled, closing her notebook for the final time that trip. "Sometimes," she said, "the reason has to find them instead." As the two women walked back toward the main compound, under a sky just beginning to fill with stars, neither of them could have known how soon that reason would announce itself, fully and unmistakably, in a voice the sanctuary had waited 9 long years to hear again. 5 weeks after Ren's arrival, a sound reached the sanctuary that had not been heard in the valley for several seasons, the distant, layered calls of a coyote group moving through the tree line beyond the southern fence. Coyotes rarely came close enough to threaten the property itself, but a particularly dry season had pushed local wildlife into unfamiliar territory searching for easier food, and that night, the calls carried closer than usual, drifting across the fields toward the stable and the wolf enclosure alike. Daniel picked up the sound first during his evening rounds, and radioed the rest of the staff immediately. "Coyotes, south fence line. Sounds like more than a couple. Everyone stay alert." Grace, finishing paperwork in the observation building, felt a familiar tightness settle in her chest. Coyotes posed little real danger to the larger animals at Fallow Ridge, but a spooked horse in an unlatched stall was a different matter entirely, and Ren's history with fear made her particularly vulnerable to any sudden disturbance. She hurried toward the stable, flashlight cutting through the dark, and arrived just as the coyote calls grew louder, closer, unmistakably drawing nearer to the southern edge of the property, where the fence line ran thinnest. Inside the stable, she found Ren already agitated, ears pinned, muscles tight, with the same fear that had gripped her the night of the accident weeks earlier. But it was Luna who commanded Grace's full attention. The old wolf stood at full alert near the stable door, body rigid, every line of her posture transformed from the calm, patient companion of recent weeks into something sharper, more focused, entirely present in a way Grace had never witnessed before. Luna's ears were pinned forward, her nose working the night air, her whole body angled protectively, between the approaching sound and the stall, where Ren stood trembling. The coyote calls rose again, closer now, close enough that even Grace could feel the hair on her arms lift in response. She reached instinctively for her radio, prepared to call for backup, when Luna did something that stopped her cold. The old wolf lifted her head toward the dark sky beyond the stable, drew in a long, deep breath, and howled. It was not the tentative sound of an animal testing a long unused voice. It was full, powerful, unmistakable, a sound that rolled out across the fields and hills of Fallow Ridge with a force that seemed impossible after 9 years of complete silence. The howl carried clear warning in every note, a declaration that this territory, this stable, this frightened creature within it, belonged under her protection. and any threat drawing near would find her standing guard. The distant coyote calls faltered, then fell silent entirely, the pack apparently choosing to redirect its search elsewhere, rather than test whatever claimed this ground so fiercely. But the retreat of the coyotes barely registered with Grace in that moment, frozen as she was at the sound she had just witnessed, a sound the entire staff had spent 9 years hoping, without much real expectation, to hear again. Inside the enclosure across the road, the rest of Luna's pack answered, rising as one, into a chorus of howls that had not included their oldest member in longer than most of them could remember. For the first time in 9 winters, Luna's voice joined theirs, rough and unpracticed, but undeniably present, undeniably hers, rising into the night sky, alongside the pack she had spent nearly a decade watching from a distance, without ever fully rejoining. Grace stood rooted at the stable door, tears rising unexpectedly as she listened to the sound roll across the valley. Inside the stall, Wren had gone still as well, no longer trembling with fear but standing calm and steady, watching the old wolf who had just, in the space of a single breath, declared herself the mare's protector before the entire sanctuary and everything beyond its fences. Daniel arrived moments later, breathless from running the length of the property, and found Grace still standing motionless at the stable door. "Was that?" he started, unable to finish the question. "That was Luna," Grace said, her voice thick with an emotion she could not fully name. 9 years, Daniel. 9 years, and she just howled like it was nothing at all. They stood together in the settling quiet, listening as the pack's chorus faded gradually back into the ordinary sounds of the night, until only the soft, steady breathing of 2 animals inside a small stable remained, one old wolf and one young mare, bound now by something far stronger than proximity or habit, something that had finally found its voice again after 9 long winters of waiting for exactly the right reason to speak. News of Luna's returned voice moved through Fallow Ridge Sanctuary like a current, reaching every corner of the small staff within a single day. Nora reviewed the incident report with something close to disbelief, reading Grace's account of the howl 3 times before setting the paper down on her desk. 9 years of complete silence, she said, shaking her head slowly. And it takes a coyote scare and a horse to bring it back. Not just a horse, Grace corrected gently. Wren specifically. I don't think just any animal would have done this. In the days that followed, Luna's transformation continued, in ways both large and small. She began howling regularly with the rest of her pack during their evening chorus, her voice growing steadier and more confident with each night, until it became difficult for anyone at the sanctuary to remember what the valley had sounded like during the long years of her silence. She also began spending more daylight hours among the other wolves in her enclosure, engaging in brief, cautious interactions she had avoided for nearly a decade. Small nudges and shared glances that suggested, slowly, a wolf rejoining the fabric of her pack rather than simply existing alongside it. Yet even as Luna reintegrated with the wolves who shared her enclosure, her nightly visits to the stable never wavered. Every evening, once the visitor paths cleared and the sanctuary settled into quiet, she made her way through the same fence gap, across the same narrow service road, to the same stable door that had, weeks earlier, opened onto an entirely unexpected friendship. Wren continued to wait for her there, ears pricked forward, greeting the old wolf's arrival with the same quiet anticipation that had marked their routine since the very first night Luna slipped through the stable's unlatched door. Nora's medical assessments of Wren showed continued and complete improvement. The mare's physical wound had long since healed into a barely visible scar, and her behavioral recovery had progressed further than Nora had dared hope during those first difficult days after the accident. Wren no longer startled at routine sounds, no longer pressed herself into stall corners at the approach of unfamiliar footsteps, and had, in fact, begun approaching staff members during checkups, with an openness that surprised even those who had cared for her from the very beginning. "She's ready to be introduced to the general horse population," Nora told Daniel during a staff meeting held to discuss Wren's long-term placement at the sanctuary. "Physically and behaviorally, there's no reason to keep her isolated in the stable any longer." The suggestion, sensible as it was from a purely clinical standpoint, prompted immediate concern from Grace. "What happens to Luna's visits if Wren moves to the main barn?" she asked. "The stable is close enough to the wolf enclosure for this to work. The main barn isn't." It was a question the staff had not yet had to answer, and it forced a longer conversation about what, exactly, they hoped to achieve going forward. Some staff members argued that Wren's full recovery and eventual integration into normal sanctuary life should take priority, even if it meant ending the unusual arrangement with Luna. Others, Grace chief among them, argued that the bond itself had become part of both animals' well-being in a way that could not simply be set aside once its most visible symptom, Wren's fear, had resolved. In the end, Daniel proposed a compromise that satisfied most concerns. Wren would remain in the stable for the time being, given gentle, supervised introductions to the wider horse community during daylight hours, while keeping her nighttime routine with Luna intact. If, over time, the mare showed a preference for full integration with the main barn, the arrangement could be revisited. But no one at Fallow Ridge felt any urgency to force an end to something that had clearly benefited both animals so profoundly. They found each other, Grace said simply, when the decision was finalized. I don't think it's our place to decide they're finished needing each other, just because the paperwork says the horse is healed. That evening, as the sanctuary settled into its now familiar nighttime quiet, Luna made her usual crossing to the stable, greeted as always by a mare who no longer trembled at footsteps or startled at shadows, but who still, every single night, waited for the particular sound of an old wolf's approach before finally, fully, settling down to rest. Months passed at Fallow Ridge Sanctuary, and the strange, quiet friendship between Luna and Wren settled into something the staff no longer thought of as unusual, but simply as part of the rhythm of the place. Visitors who walked the sanctuary paths during the day sometimes caught sight of the old wolf resting near the fence closest to the stable, watching the mare with the same patient attention she had shown from the very beginning, and those who happened to linger until evening occasionally witnessed the small, remarkable ritual of Luna, crossing the service road at dusk, greeted always by a mare who had long since stopped needing the comfort, but never stopped wanting it. Grace kept a small folder of notes on the pair, separate from the official sanctuary records, a personal record of everything she had witnessed since that first restless night, when Luna paced the fence line, drawn by a scent and a sound she could not yet explain. Rereading those notes one quiet afternoon, she found herself struck by how much had changed, not only in the two animals at the center of the story, but in the way the entire staff had come to understand what healing could look like when it arrived from an unexpected direction. Margaret Doyle returned to the sanctuary twice more over the following year, each visit adding new observations to what had become, in academic circles, a small but notable case study on cross-species bonding in rescued animals. She never claimed to fully explain why this particular pairing had succeeded where so many others had failed, though she often noted, in her published notes on the subject, that the timing had mattered as much as anything else. A wolf finally ready to care for something again. A horse finally arriving at the exact moment that readiness had nowhere else to go. Some bonds can't be arranged, Margaret told Grace during her final visit, watching Luna and Wren together in the fading evening light. They can only be allowed. I think that's the real lesson here. You didn't create this. You just didn't get in its way. Wren, fully recovered in body and spirit, eventually did join the main barn's horse population for daytime turnout, grazing, and socializing among the other horses through the warmer hours, before returning each evening to the stable she still considered home, the one place at Fallow Ridge where an old wolf waited for her without fail. Luna, for her part, remained an active member of her pack, howling each evening in a chorus that no longer carried even a trace of the silence that had once defined her, yet never once missing her nightly crossing to the stable, regardless of season or weather. Daniel liked to tell visitors, when the story came up, that Fallow Ridge had learned more from this single friendship than from years of careful, deliberate rehabilitation work with other animals. We spent 9 years trying every method we knew to bring that wolf back, he would say. Turns out all she needed was something that needed her back just as much. Grace often found herself returning to the fence line in quiet moments, watching the pair rest together in the evening light, a scene so ordinary now that it was easy to forget how impossible it once would have seemed. An old wolf who had lost everything, and a young horse who had nearly lost everything too, had somehow found in each other exactly what neither the wild nor the careful hands of sanctuary staff had been able to fully provide alone. On the anniversary of Wren's arrival, exactly 1 year after the storm that had brought her, injured and terrified, to Fallow Ridge, Grace stood once more at the familiar fence, watching Luna and Wren settle together for the night, as the last light faded from the valley sky. The old wolf's howl rose clear and strong minutes later, joined by the rest of her pack in a chorus that carried far across the quiet hills, a sound that had once seemed lost forever, now as steady and certain as the sunrise. Somewhere in that sound, Grace liked to think, was the story of everything the sanctuary had learned that year, about patience, about trust, about the strange and often unexplainable ways that broken things find their way back to wholeness. Two animals, never meant by nature to comfort one another, had built something between them that no textbook could have predicted and no keeper could have engineered, proving, in the simplest and most lasting way possible, that sometimes healing arrives not from the care we plan, but from the unexpected company we are wise enough to allow. And every night since, without exception, the old wolf still crossed the narrow road to the stable, and the young mare still waited for her at the door, two creatures bound forever by a friendship neither the wild nor the world had ever thought to expect.